Hello everybody and welcome. Today we are diving into our most recent summer adventure, which just wrapped up here on our channel, which of course was the Arizona Peace Trail. Now if you haven't seen that 4-part series yet, I would recommend going back and watching that first. It was our 200-mile off-road journey where me and my cousin started in Dateland, worked our way north all the way up western Arizona to our destination in Kingman. This video is going to be dealing exclusively with that trip, talking about some things we didn't get to feature in the main video, and kind of just talking overall about the Peace Trail in general. So if you have questions about the trip, or you have questions about the trail in particular, hopefully I'll answer some of those today. In fact, on the bottom of your screen right now, you can see the topics that we'll be covering today. Of course, it's impossible to cover everything about this trail and the trip, so if you have any more questions, feel free to drop a comment below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. With that being said, let's get right into it. Okay, so the first phase I want to talk about is the route planning and the navigation. I feel like those two go hand in hand for this trip. Now, basically I start with stringing a bunch of waypoints together, looking at trails, looking at things, and building the trip from there. Now, typically I build the trip around destinations, so waypoints, ghost towns, specific things that we want to see on the trail. That's usually how I build the trail. This trip was a bit different because the trail itself was the main attraction. So it was a little bit backwards, so I started with kind of the overall route, the trail, where we were going, and then from there I kind of pinpointed places that we'd be able to check out, places that were in the area that we could explore. Of course, that involves many hours in Google Earth, and from there I build the trip itinerary. So aside from Google Earth, one of the biggest assets to the Arizona Peace Trail is this. This is the Arizona Peace Trail Atlas. It's a massive book that covers literally every single turn, every direction on the entire 675-mile trail. It's a really valuable asset that I would definitely recommend. It is a little bit expensive, but if you are going on the trail, it is extremely useful in both the planning and the actual navigation. We referenced this pretty heavily when we were out on the trail, and of course it was invaluable when we were planning the trip. Now, for those of you that like to navigate by phone or by tablet, the Arizona Peace Trail also offers the map in an electronic format that you can reference on your device on the trail. Now, the reason I bought this book specifically is that even though the Peace Trail website does offer free KMZ files and route tracks, the file is so big because the trail is massive that it just kept locking up my Google Earth program and it was not able to function on any computer I tried, even my editing computer. So I bought this, that way I could go through myself, drop in coordinates, drop in turns, look at the maps that they have to help me build my overall route. So after spending that time doing the research, what we ultimately come up with is the master itinerary. This is, again, the holy grail that we reference extensively while out on the trail. And inside of it, it has turn-by-turn directions, coordinates to different campsites and sightseeing things we're going to do, and just overall information that we think we may need. Packing lists, emergency situation. It has a place for us to take notes on what's going on, where we're at. It's a very extensive document that just the act of creating this alone helps me to get a pretty good idea when we're out on the trail what we're going to be doing. This one happened to be 32 pages long, so this really is the primary navigating source on the trail. The atlas was kind of secondary to that, and then sometimes, very occasionally, we used GPS devices to help us pinpoint just some things and kind of track our overall progress. This summer special was the first time I used this, which is a Garmin InReach device, which I've been using for the last 6 months as a way for me, especially when I'm out by myself, to keep in touch with family and friends back home. I used it throughout the trip to text family just to say, hey, we're on track, we're doing great, everything's going fine. And likewise, if we would have gotten into a bind or a real emergency, this could have been used to help relay our coordinates to family, to emergency services. We would have been able to get in touch very quickly and very easily if we needed help. So I felt better carrying this on the trail, and I used that in addition to the atlas and the itinerary. Now in the past, I've also talked about how I don't like to use phones or tablets to navigate, but this trip I actually did use my phone just a little bit. I used the Gaia GPS app. I used the free version because it's good enough for me. It came in handy in a couple of instances where we were looking for something very specific. So one example, when we were looking for those Aztec aerial directional markers, when we're out there in the desert and you're looking across the barren landscape, it was actually pretty hard to see and find where those were at because it was rocks everywhere. It all looked the same. Using the pre-programmed waypoints I did ahead of time, I was able to use the app, navigate within about 50 feet, and it made it super easy to find it and saved us some overall time just walking through the desert. So again, not something I referenced heavily, not something I would rely on, but in combo with the GPS devices and our other primary navigating sources, it worked out pretty good. Now, having covered the route planning and navigation, I want to move to the next topic, which is campsites. Now, on the Arizona Peace Trail is a huge route. You have so many options of what you can do. You can stay at hotels in the major towns if you plan it right. You can do segments at a time where you make a day trip. And of course, one of the nice parts of the trail is that it covers a ton of camping opportunities, beautiful camp spots in a variety of climates. So we opted to camp each night of the trail, and it was planned around kind of our overall pace of the trip. So the first day, we wanted to camp a little bit south of I-10. That way we could cover around, I think it was 40 miles the first day, in addition to the 2.5-hour highway drive from our house. So that was the reason why we camped in that spot. And it was also a very scenic spot, just gorgeous volcanic deserty hills that when we got there, we were really glad that we ended up picking that spot. The second night was at Swansea, the ghost town. And there they actually had some primitive campgrounds. I wouldn't call it developed because there was no water, there was no electricity. It had a pit toilet, but that was actually about half a mile, 3/4 of a mile away from the actual campsite. And that was nice. That was cool to be able to have a nice flat area, have a table and a bench and a ramada to just enjoy. And it was also located extremely close to the ruins at Swansea, which makes it a really nice opportunity for people wanting to camp. I think there were 5 total campgrounds there, and there was only one other person there when we went back in February. The third night was more of an impromptu night. It was kind of a weather-based decision that we made. We were in Lake Havasu for an early dinner, checking the weather forecast, and we knew it was going to be raining when we woke up in the morning. Now, our original plan was to kind of cut a little further west into the Mojave Mountains, camp somewhere around there, and then in the morning continue through the mountains, bunch of washes up to I-40. And with the impending entire day of rain, we decided to stick closer to the highway. That way in the morning we could either continue on our planned route, or if we needed to save time or we didn't like the conditions, could easily hop out to the highway where we would connect with the next branch of the trail. And that, I think, ultimately was a good decision. We ended up finding a parcel of BLM land just a couple of miles away from where we originally planned. The last night of the trail was in the Black Mountains, and it was phenomenal. It was very beautiful, very scenic. It was still quite wet and rainy when we got to it, but the next morning it was just fantastic. That wasn't our primary campsite, but as part of the route planning back before the trip, I usually come up with 2 to 3 different sites in different locations. That way we have a backup and then we have a backup to the backup. And that's what I think that campsite was. on night 4 of the trip, which turned out to be pretty good. Even though it was next to a mine, it was a great view. The hill just to our south kind of sheltered the rain, sheltered the wind. It was actually quite perfect. All of those campsites were on BLM land, which in my experience I have found that BLM and Forest Service land are always the most open to camping. Now the Peace Trail does cross through some forest and parcels of state trust land, so you are allowed to camp on those too, but the rules get a little more specific with state trust land. You do want to carry a state trust land permit, which I think is around 25 bucks a year, so I carry one all the time just because here in Arizona, you never know when you're going to cross it, and the Peace Trail certainly does cross in a few spots. I would recommend getting that. That's really the only permit you need for the entire trail, as everything else is BLM land or forest land. So the next thing I want to cover is the weather and kind of timing of when you might want to do the trail. Now, we did the trail back in February. It was mid-February, and the reason we did it so early was because my schedule and my cousin's schedule was pretty hectic, and that was really the only time we could overlap. Normally we go in May, but this year we went early. And for the lower elevation sections, which I would say that most of the Peace Trail is kind of desert to low desert elevation, I think winter to springtime would definitely be the ideal time to go. You want to avoid summer pretty much on the entire southern half of the Peace Trail, because some of those areas in Kofa are rugged, remote, and can get extremely hot. So for that reason, it's good to go in the spring, winter, kind of fall area. Now, the thing about the Peace Trail is it's so diverse that the highest elevation sections are up over 7,000 feet in the Hualapai Mountains outside of Kingman. And that was another hindrance for us. We actually had to avoid that area because at the time it was already snowpacked. They were getting more snow during our trip, and then shortly after they got blasted again. So that's the highest elevation section. The area in the Black Mountains is a bit higher. It was about 3,500 feet. Not super high, but if you want to do the entire trail, I don't know if there is an ideal time. The window is going to be very tight from when the upper elevation sections are passable and the lower elevation sections aren't completely miserable. So I think you'd be extremely limited and hard pressed to find a good time. Although maybe in April, getting into May, you might be able to start getting that best of both worlds situation. Or you can do what we did and, well, it was break up the trail and plan based off of the weather. Now, speaking of weather, we ran into a fair bit of weather on the last couple of days of our trip. Now, that was expected, and we knew that we would be getting some storms starting night 3 of our trip. We knew from there on we could be dealing with rain, and we actually got a bit more than we were expecting. So definitely put a little bit of a damper on our plans. It's no fun camping in the rain. You can't really get out and do stuff too much, but I think we made the best of it. Up until that point, the weather had been great. Another thing to talk about there was the spot in the Black Mountains where we actually had to kind of divert our course and not continue on the official Peace Trail due to weather. So at that point, we got to this really steep hill. It was raining. We had been experiencing slick trails and mud all throughout the day, and when we got to that point, we just kind of stopped, scouted out the area, and we had to make a judgment call. And ultimately, I am happy with the choice we made. Obviously, it's easy to look back and say, oh, well, we could have tried it, we easily could have done it, and maybe we could have, but at that point in the trip, we were literally about 15 miles away from the end. We had been having just a fantastic time. Despite the weather, we had been okay, and we decided that the best call was to play it safe and find a safer way around, which is ultimately what we did. And ultimately, I think I'm pretty happy with that decision because we'll always be able to go back in better weather and no accidents, no incidents to report on this trip. So that's the thing about the weather. It can change on you quick, and I think it's always best to play it safe, go prepared, but be smart about it too. So lastly, I want to talk about some pros and cons to our trip. I think this is a good way to kind of reflect back and look back and maybe learn some things for the next time. Some pros: the tent. This was the first time where I used the rooftop tent for back-to-back days of camping. Up until this point, I had been going out on one-night trips, where the first day I did a lot of wheeling, exploring, whatever. I'd set up camp and then I could kind of be lazy about it, pack up and go home. This trip was different because we had a schedule to keep. We would have a busy day and then we would set up camp, have to get out of there fairly early, pack up our whole camp and do it all over again. But I think it went really well. The very first night, the next morning, we left all of our sleeping bags and our pillows up there, and it was a little bit of a pain to try and collapse down and get down to a point where we could put the cover over. Now that was because we had the rain fly on, we had fluffy sleeping bags in there, and the pillows. And you can actually see the tent, and some of the footage actually looks a little bit sideways. That's because there was so much junk in there. Now from that point on, starting the second night, we left our pillows out, left the sleeping bags in, and that actually worked fairly well. So it was nice being able to leave most of our bedding up in the tent. And of course, with the weather on this trip, we left the rain fly on because we didn't really know what to expect, and it also helped to kind of trap that warmth, keep us warm throughout the night, which was actually surprisingly warm. The first few nights were chilly. It got down into the mid-30s. Which is cold for the desert, but we were able to bundle up, stay warm, and it held up through the rain. I think it did ultimately help us save time, so when we got to camp, we were able to quickly set everything up. Likewise, in the morning, close everything down, pack it up. We're able to just kind of keep that flow and keep that rhythm going throughout the whole trip. So really happy with the tent and how it did. Now the pacing of the trip, I like the way we set it up. So we had 5 days, we covered about half of the trail, and I think we went at a pretty good pace. It wasn't too quick, it wasn't too slow. I know there's some people, there's itineraries out there to do the entire 675-mile trail in 5 days, and that basically be going double the speed that we did. And that'd be a lot, or every day would be over 100 miles. So you really got to knock out the miles, you got to have a quick pace. And while that might be for some people, I liked kind of taking it a little bit slower. I liked stopping at things that we wanted to check out, spending the time because we always have the option, and doing what we did sets us up to one day maybe start in Kingman, go through the Hualapai Mountains, kind of come down back towards Swansea, and then cover the other section of the trail that we didn't get to. So I think half of the trail is perfect for a 5-day run. Of course you can do more, of course you can do less. You could do a single day and just cover it kind of sections at a time. The nice part about the Peace Trail Atlas is that it breaks it up into, I want to say, about 30 different segments, and all of them are, maybe 10 to 20, 30 miles long, and you can kind of cover them at your own pace throughout the entire trail system. Now next up, I want to talk about the battery box on our Jeep. This was kind of the first big trip where we had it. It was just installed on our Jeep not long before the trip. It was really nice to have power. It worked great. I was able to charge cameras, charge phones, whatever we needed to throughout the trip that required power. It was great, and I think that having the battery box really helped to encourage us to stay out camping, because in the past when we've done trips, we typically would rent a cabin. We would stay at somewhere that had power and kind of allow us to recharge literally and kind of refresh. But on this trip, power wasn't a concern. We were able to have every part we needed, wasn't an issue, and we were able to camp each night. I think it just overall helped to encourage us to camp more, which was nice. Another kind of nitpicky thing, and this relates to the Jeep and kind of just the way we loaded it and set up. This trip was definitely the most gear we had. Even though we had the tent kind of saving room, it wasn't really saving any weight. And once I got the Jeep loaded down, it was almost shocking to see how much it was sagging. And this is kind of a two-part issue because I would like to pack a little bit lighter in the future, but also I think my coil springs have kind of had their fill. Over the last year or so, I've noticed that it's starting to sag a little more, kind of starting to lean one way or another. So in the future, I do hope to address that issue. Not exactly sure yet, but that was not a big issue, but there were a few places. On day one in the Palomas Plain, some of those pretty serious washouts. And then also on day 3, outside of Lake Havasu City, were a few places where we did scrape. We did hear some things hitting underneath the doors and up front. And that would have been resolved if the Jeep were a little bit lighter or if the Jeep were sitting up a little bit higher. So not a big issue, but just one of the things that come to mind about the trip. And I really think that's about it. Hopefully in my rambling, I was able to talk about some things specifically about our trip and also about the overall trail, the Arizona Peace Trail in general. It's a great opportunity. They've got atlases, they've got maps, the signage is great, and they're also continuing to develop. So there's designated staging areas, everyone working together, BLM and all of the 4x4 clubs, just coming together to really create this gem of a trail that is the Arizona Peace Trail. With that being said, I do appreciate you watching this video, and more importantly, I thank you for watching the entire trip series. I do hope to return to the Peace Trail not too far in the future to complete the rest of the loop. It's a great trail and it's a lot of fun, so I would definitely recommend it. And as always, thank you for watching this video, and we'll see you on the next adventure real soon.